A Ukrainian missile just destroyed a Russian military factory 900 kilometers inside Russian territory. Not a NATO weapon, not an American-supplied system, a Ukrainian-built cruise missile, the FP-5 Flamingo. Carrying a 150-kilogram warhead, tore through a facility deep inside Russia that Moscow believed was completely untouchable. At the same moment, NATO allies at The Hague pledged to spend 5% of their GDP on defense, the most aggressive military spending target in the alliance's entire 76-year history. An $80 billion military support package for Ukraine just activated. So here's the question that has Russian generals losing sleep tonight. What if Putin already lost and nobody told him? To understand why this moment is so seismic, you need to go back to February 24th, 2022. That was the day Vladimir Putin launched what he called a special military operation against Ukraine. His generals told him it would take 72 hours, 3 days to topple Kyiv, 3 days to install a pro-Russian government, 3 days to humiliate NATO and prove that the West was too weak, too divided, and too afraid to stop him. Putin was catastrophically wrong. Ukrainian forces held the capital. The Russian military, supposedly the second most powerful on Earth, suffered losses that shocked every defense analyst on the planet. Convoys stalled. Logistics collapsed. Elite paratroopers got destroyed at Hostomel Airport in the war's opening hours. The lightning strike became a grinding, bloody stalemate. And what followed was something the Kremlin never modeled for. A unified Western response that poured weapons, money, and intelligence into Ukraine at a scale not seen since World War II. NATO rallied in a way that surprised everyone, including NATO itself. In the first year, the alliance sent anti-tank Javelin missiles, Stinger air defense systems, and artillery ammunition. Then came the heavy weapons, howitzers, HIMARS rocket systems from the United States, capable of striking Russian supply depots 80 kilometers away with stunning precision. M1 Abrams tanks, Leopard 2 tanks from Germany and Poland. The weapons pipeline grew more sophisticated with every passing month. Then came the F-16 fighter jets. For months, Ukraine begged for modern Western aircraft. Washington resisted. European allies hesitated. The fear was escalation, that giving Ukraine a fourth-generation fighter would provoke a nuclear response from Moscow. But Russia kept striking Ukrainian cities with missiles and Shahed drones. The calculation shifted. Denmark, the Netherlands, Norway, and Belgium agreed to transfer F-16s. By 2024, Ukrainian pilots were flying them in combat. By 2025, Ukraine had over 60 Western jets operational. But here is what most people missed completely. And while the world focused on the hardware, the tanks, the jets, the missiles, something far more important was happening behind the scenes. Ukraine was not just receiving weapons. Ukraine was building its own weapons industry from scratch, under active wartime conditions. Drone factories, missile development programs, electronic warfare laboratories, and a brand new long-range cruise missile program that would eventually produce the weapon. That just shocked the entire world. The FP-5 Flamingo, first publicly revealed in August 2025, the Flamingo was unlike anything Ukraine had produced before. A domestically designed cruise missile, range reported at up to 3,000 kilometers. Warhead weight of 1,150 kilograms. That range puts Moscow itself within reach. That warhead weight can destroy fortified industrial targets. This was not a modified Soviet system. This was original Ukrainian engineering, built under bombardment in a country fighting for its survival. While Ukraine was building its arsenal, NATO was undergoing its own transformation. Defense spending across the alliance surged. At the June 2025 NATO summit in The Hague, the most consequential NATO gathering since the Cold War ended, allied heads of state agreed to a target of 5% of GDP on core defense requirements. 5%. The old target was 2%. This was not a symbolic declaration. This was a mobilization signal. This was NATO telling its defense industries, expand capacity, hire workers, build more faster. And right at the center of all this activity was an $80 billion support package specifically for Ukraine, a figure that exceeded Kyiv's own request by 4 times. But what happened next, nobody was prepared for. On June 10, 2026, a Ukrainian FP-5 Flamingo cruise missile struck the Votkinsk machine-building plant deep inside the Russian region of Udmurtia. This was not a frontline target. This was not a logistics depot near the border. Votkinsk is over 1,300 kilometers from Ukrainian territory. And the Votkinsk plant is not just any factory. This is where Russia manufactures the Iskander ballistic missile system, the very weapon Russia has been firing at Ukrainian cities for 4 years. Ukraine just destroyed Russia's missile factory with a missile Russia didn't know Ukraine had. The psychological impact of this strike cannot be overstated. Russian military planners had constructed their entire strategic calculus around one fundamental assumption: that Russian territory beyond a certain depth was immune, untouchable, safe from Ukrainian retaliation. That assumption died the moment the Flamingo hit Votkinsk. Every factory, every command center, every military-industrial facility inside Russia, no matter how far from Ukraine, is now theoretically within reach. And this is where Russia made their fatal mistake. For 2 years, Moscow dismissed Ukraine's domestic weapons programs as propaganda. Russian state media mocked Ukrainian drones as toys. The Flamingo program was called science fiction by Russian military. Bloggers as recently as early 2025, Russia genuinely did not believe Ukraine could develop a long-range precision strike capability without Western help. They were wrong. Ukraine not only developed it, they did it while under constant bombardment in dispersed underground facilities, using supply chains that Russia had no visibility into. But here is the detail nobody is reporting. The Votkinsk strike was not a solo operation. Ukrainian forces launched the Flamingo strike as part of a coordinated multi-domain operation. At the same time, the cruise missile struck the factory. Ukrainian electronic warfare units disrupted Russian air defense radar networks along the attack corridor. Ukrainian drones, hundreds of them, flooded Russian air defense systems simultaneously, creating a saturation effect that overwhelmed radar operators and consumed interceptor missiles. By the time Russia understood what was happening, the Flamingo was already through. The intercept window had closed. The missile had landed. This is not improvisation. This is doctrine. Ukraine has spent 4 years studying exactly how Russian air defense systems work, their radar frequencies, their engagement envelopes, their reaction times, their human operator limitations. They built a strike package specifically designed to exploit every weakness simultaneously. The result was a perfect breach of what Russia thought was an impenetrable defensive bubble. What happened in the next 6 hours changed everything. Within hours of the Votkinsk strike, the Russian Ministry of Defense released a statement claiming the attack had been repelled. The missile had been shot down. No damage had occurred. Then the satellite imagery arrived. Commercial satellite providers, including Planet Labs, published high-resolution images showing significant structural damage to the Votkinsk complex. Multiple buildings destroyed. A visible impact crater. Smoke still rising. Russia's denial collapsed within the news cycle, and the strategic embarrassment was total. Putin ordered an emergency meeting of the Russian Security Council, according to Ukrainian military intelligence, whose track record on Kremlin intelligence has been remarkably accurate throughout this war. The meeting was characterized by fury and confusion. How did Ukraine acquire this capability? How did it get through? Who failed? The questions flew, the answers were inadequate, and in that moment, the Russian political leadership confronted something they had carefully avoided confronting for 2 years: the possibility that this war is not going the way they told the Russian people it was going. And this is the part that has NATO commanders worried. Not the strike itself, not even Russia's denial. What worries NATO commanders is the question of retaliation. A leader who has been publicly humiliated, whose air defenses failed on live satellite imagery in front of the entire world, is a leader under pressure to respond disproportionately. Russian doctrine allows for nuclear signaling in exactly this kind of scenario, when conventional military prestige is damaged, when deterrence credibility is questioned, when domestic political pressure demands a show of strength. Russia has already conducted nuclear exercises in 2024 with tactical nuclear weapons. Moscow has repeatedly threatened nuclear use when faced with escalatory Western weapons decisions. And now, for the first time in this war, Ukrainian weapons struck a strategic defense manufacturing facility at extreme range, using a capability Russia categorically denied existed. Meanwhile, the $80 billion NATO support package is not a future pledge. The activation is underway right now. The package includes long-range precision munitions at previously restricted quantities, Storm Shadow cruise missiles with the targeting data restrictions removed, additional F-16 airframes, plus the full suite of air-to-ground munitions Europe had previously withheld. Air defense systems, including Patriot batteries and NASAMS networks, supplied a number sufficient to genuinely saturate coverage over major Ukrainian cities. Armored vehicle packages totaling thousands of units, and critically, financial support for Ukraine's own domestic defense industry, including the Flamingo program and the drone factories that now produce over 4 million units per year. 4 million drones per year. That number alone should terrify Russian military logistics planners. Ukraine's drone production has become the most significant tactical equalizer of the entire war. Russian armored columns that would have been essentially unchallenged in any previous conflict now face constant overhead. Surveillance and precision strike capability from relatively cheap, mass-produced systems that Ukraine can afford to lose at scale. Russia's loss rate on armored vehicles in 2025 alone reached devastating levels. The Ukrainian Ministry of Defense documented over 12,000 Russian tank losses since the war began, over 24,000 armored fighting vehicles, over 44,000 artillery systems. These are not propaganda numbers. These are corroborated by open-source intelligence, satellite imagery, and independent organizations tracking the conflict. Russia is burning through its military-industrial capacity at a rate that Soviet-era stockpiles cannot indefinitely replace. And crucially, the quality of replacement equipment is declining. Russia is now fielding T-55 tanks from Cold War storage depots, vehicles designed in the 1950s. Against a Ukrainian military that NATO has trained, armed, and equipped 21st century standards, the $80 billion Endgame package is designed to exploit exactly this Russian vulnerability, not to drag the war out indefinitely, not to achieve some ambiguous political stalemate. The strategic logic behind this package, as described by analysts at CSIS, the Atlantic Council, and Russia, is to accelerate Russia's military-industrial breakdown to the point where Putin faces a choice between a negotiated settlement on terms Ukraine can accept or a complete collapse of Russian conventional military capability in the theater. That is the endgame, and it has officially begun. Let's slow down here, because what is unfolding right now is not just a battlefield story. This is a historic inflection point, the kind of moment that geopolitical historians will study for decades. And to understand the full significance, you need to break down what is actually happening across 3 dimensions simultaneously: the military dimension, the economic dimension, and the political dimension. On the military dimension, Ukraine's transformation since 2022 is genuinely without precedent in modern warfare. A country that started the full-scale invasion with mostly Soviet-era equipment, outdated tanks, aging artillery, limited air defense has become, within 4 years, one of the most combat-hardened, drone-saturated, electronic warfare-capable militaries on the planet. Ukrainian commanders have developed tactical doctrines that Western military academies are now studying and incorporating into their own training programs. The way Ukraine uses drone swarms to saturate air defense networks, what they did during the Votkhinsk strike, has rewritten the textbook on penetrating layered air defense. This matters enormously for the 3 scenarios now unfolding. Scenario 1, accelerated Russian military collapse. In this scenario, the combination of Ukraine's new long-range strike capability, the $80 billion Western support package, and Russia's deteriorating equipment quality creates a feedback loop of military failure. Russia loses the ability to maintain coherent frontline positions. Ukrainian forces exploit breakthroughs with combined arms operations, the same doctrine NATO has been training them to execute since 2022. Russian manpower losses, which the CSS estimated at roughly 415,000 casualties in 2025 alone, become unsustainable. Putin faces mass desertion, domestic unrest, and a military that can no longer execute offensive operations. The war ends not with a dramatic peace conference, but with Russian forces simply disintegrating. This scenario is not fantasy. It mirrors how the Soviet Union's Afghan adventure ended, how Russia's first Chechen war ended, and how imperial military adventures throughout history have ended when the political will to sustain losses collapses. Scenario 2, frozen conflict with strategic deterrence. In this scenario, the $80 billion package and Ukraine's new capabilities force Russia to the negotiating table, but not to complete surrender. A ceasefire line is established roughly along current front lines. Ukraine does not recover all occupied territories immediately, but receives ironclad security guarantees from a coalition of European powers. Crucially, Ukraine's own military-industrial capacity. Its drone factories, its Flamingo program, its emerging defense technology sector becomes a permanent deterrent. Russia retains occupied territory for now, but faces a Ukraine that can strike 3,000 kilometers into Russian territory at any moment. This functions as mutual deterrence. Neither side wants escalation. A frozen conflict. Yes, but one where Ukraine is protected, sovereign, and economically viable. Zelensky himself signaled openness to this structure in late 2025 when he indicated willingness to suspend the NATO membership bid in exchange for genuine, binding security guarantees from multiple Western nations. Scenario 3. Russian escalation and nuclear signaling. This is the scenario that keeps NATO commanders awake at night and the one that demands the most honest analysis. A cornered and humiliated Putin, facing domestic pressure and military failure, may choose to escalate rather than negotiate. Russia's nuclear doctrine is explicit. Tactical nuclear weapons can be used when the existence of the Russian state is perceived to be threatened. Putin has expanded the definition of threatening Russia so broadly that it now potentially includes strikes on Russian territory. The Volkhinsk attack pushed directly on this nerve. NATO intelligence agencies are monitoring Russian nuclear force posture continuously. So far, no changes to nuclear readiness have been observed that go beyond the elevated posture Russia has maintained since 2022. But the risk window is real. Analysts at Russia published a sobering assessment in late 2025, arguing that Russia is entering a phase of what they called hybrid escalation, cyber attacks on European infrastructure, assassinations of Ukrainian-linked figures in Europe, and political interference operations designed to fracture Western unity without crossing the nuclear threshold. And now we get to the most important question of this entire video. Is the $80 billion endgame actually enough? And can NATO sustain the political will to see it through? Here's what the top military experts are saying. General Christopher Cavoli, the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, has consistently argued that Ukraine's military performance has exceeded every initial Western assessment. He has repeatedly told the U.S. Congress that Ukraine is not just surviving, it is developing military capabilities that directly benefit NATO's own strategic position. Every Russian tank destroyed in Ukraine is a tank that will never roll toward a NATO border. Every Russian logistics system that gets hit teaches NATO planners exactly where Russian vulnerabilities lie. Ukraine is, as Cavoli has said explicitly, doing the work that would otherwise fall to NATO allies. Ben Hodges, the former commanding general of U.S. Army Europe, has gone further. He argues that Ukraine has already won strategically in the sense that Russia has failed to achieve any of its original pre-war aims. Russia wanted to eliminate Ukraine as a sovereign state. Ukraine still exists. Russia wanted to fracture NATO. NATO has expanded to 32 members, with Finland and Sweden ending decades of neutrality, joined specifically because of Russian aggression. Russia wanted to demonstrate Western weakness, and Western defense spending has surged to levels not seen since the Cold War. But here is the historical comparison that puts this in sharpest focus. In 1943, after the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in history, Nazi Germany launched no further strategic offensives on the Eastern Front. Kursk did not end the war immediately. Germany fought on for 2 more brutal years. But Kursk was the moment the strategic initiative permanently transferred to the Soviet Union. Every subsequent German operation was reactive, defensive, and ultimately futile. Military historians who study the Russo-Ukrainian War are increasingly pointing to the 2025-2026 period as the equivalent of Kursk, Russia's 2025 offensive, which aimed to seize the critical Kupiansk-Lyman rail hub and break through Ukrainian defensive lines in Donetsk failed. Ukraine's military chief confirmed this publicly. Russia gained some territory in 2025, grinding forward at enormous cost, but achieved no strategic breakthrough. No major city fell, no Ukrainian operational collapse occurred, and now, in 2026, Ukraine possesses long-range precision strike capability, the most sophisticated drone force in the world, and an $80 billion Western support package, specifically designed to deliver a decisive strategic blow. Russia's next move is deeply constrained. Putin cannot politically afford to acknowledge failure. He cannot negotiate without appearing to have lost. He cannot escalate to nuclear weapons without triggering a NATO response. That would be catastrophically worse for Russia than a negotiated settlement. He is trapped in a strategic box of his own construction. The special military operation that was supposed to last 72 hours has now entered its fifth year. Russian GDP has been diverted massively to military spending. International sanctions have cut Russia off from Western technology, finance, and trade. Inflation is surging inside Russia. The demographic cost of 415,000 casualties in a single year, young men who will never return to their families, their farms, their factories, will haunt Russian society for a generation. What should Ukraine do right now? The answer from every credible military analyst is the same. Continue exactly what they are doing, but faster. More flamingo strikes against Russian military-industrial targets. More drone production, more training of reserve forces, more integration of Western weapons into combined arms doctrine, and critically, keep Europe's political will intact. Because the $80 billion endgame only works if European leaders maintain public support for Ukraine through what may be another difficult winter of Russian energy warfare and drone attacks on civilian infrastructure. Historians will remember this moment for a specific reason. Not the Votkhinsk strike alone, not the NATO summit alone, not the $80 billion figure alone. They will remember it as the moment the war's fundamental logic reversed. For 3 years, Russia's strategic bet was that time favored Moscow, that the West would eventually tire, that Ukraine would eventually break, that the alliance would eventually fracture. The $80 billion endgame package, combined with Ukraine's demonstrated indigenous strike capability, reaching 900 to 3,000 kilometers into Russian territory, destroys that assumption completely. Time no longer favors Russia. And Putin, who built his entire political identity on projecting strategic patience, now faces a ticking clock. Historians will remember this moment for a specific reason. Not the Votkhinsk strike alone, not the NATO summit alone, not the $80 billion figure alone. They will remember it as the moment the war's fundamental logic reversed. For 3 years, Russia's strategic bet was that time favored Moscow, that the West would eventually tire, that Ukraine would eventually break, that the alliance would eventually fracture. The $80 billion endgame package, combined with Ukraine's demonstrated indigenous strike capability, reaching 900 to 3,000 kilometers into Russian territory, destroys that assumption completely. Time no longer favors Russia. And Putin, who built his entire political identity on projecting strategic patience, now faces a ticking clock. Here's the single takeaway from everything you just watched. This war was never going to be decided in one dramatic battle. It was always going to be decided by which side ran out of capacity, military capacity, economic capacity, political capacity first. For 3 years, Russia bet that would be Ukraine. The FP5 Flamingo striking Votkhinsk, the $80 billion NATO package activating, the Hague summit pledging 5% of GDP to defense. All of it points to one brutal conclusion. Russia bet wrong. Ukraine is not just surviving. Ukraine is building the military, industrial, and strategic capacity to win on its own terms. And NATO has just written the largest check in alliance history to make sure that capacity reaches full power. The question for the comments section is this: do you believe Putin will negotiate before his conventional military collapses, or will he escalate in desperation? Drop your answer below, because the next video will cover exactly what Russian military escalation actually looks like in 2026 and why some NATO analysts believe the most dangerous 6 months of this entire war are still ahead. If this broke something open for you, share it. The algorithm buries this kind of analysis. You spreading it is the only way it reaches people who need to hear it.